This is Jane Low, and I'm here in Singapore's Operational Technology Cybersecurity Forum. And with me today, I'm very pleased and very privileged to have Tim Conway and also Rob Lee, who are both very notable SANS instructors. And for any of our audience who are in cybersecurity professionals in operational technology, you would have heard of them. So need no further introduction. So very privileged to have you guys here. So thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you
for having us.
Yeah, so you'll be sharing with us on, some of the highlights of your presentations and also of perhaps some highlights from the SANS reports, right, and surveys. And so the first question, I guess, is the easiest question to start off the podcast is the cyber threat landscape, which you touch on.
The easy one. Describe all of it. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. Which you touch on. You refer to the colonial pipelines as well as the water treatment plant incident, which we also spoke about in our last podcast 2 years ago. And Rob, you talked about the latest 8th and 9th malware that was discovered recently, which is Fuxnet and
Fuxnet and Frostygoop.
Right,
okay. Weird names in this.
Yeah, I know.
Who names this stuff? Yeah.
And also Pipe Dream, we talked about last year as well.
Yeah.
But before we get into all these latest malware threats and all that, but I just want to get your quick take on CrowdStrike because it's not really specifically operational technology.
Sure.
It's kind of cyber
Good lesson
security.
learned,
Yeah.
I will talk through a couple of things. So the things that shocked me about that, meaning there's things that happened in the organization that allowed that to go out without appropriate testing, without appropriate kind of verification. That's disappointing, and I know it's disappointing to them as well, and they're going to do what they need to do to fix it. But the real shock to me, going back to the 1980s with technology like Blue Coat and McAfee ePolicy Orchestrator, we've had a history of technologies that get a corrupt signature update, and it impacts how that tool functions. So for 20 to 30 years, we have ensured that we have sort of a bake-in or a soak-in method where new signature updates are coming in, and they're sitting in a test environment that has nothing to do with operations or production. And it sits there for a period of time, and then it moves into corporate business assets that aren't real-time operational assets. Then it moves into backup systems, and then it moves into actual production. So you are 4 to 5 to 6 weeks out, and if ever there was a corrupt signature, it would get replaced and fixed before you ever saw it, even in the slightest of impactful environments. What happened with this, I believe it was just generally more trusted technology and the assumption of we want to take new signature updates in as fast as possible to better protect our systems, and we forgot what we've learned over 30 years, that even with a trusted vendor, even with trusted providers, you still need to architect in resilience. No one should have taken these signatures straight into a process environment that left millions of people stranded, impacted sectors. That is at fault to the asset owner operators for allowing that to occur.
Trust but verify, yes.
Yeah, you're not able to with CrowdStrike. If you have it, it is kind of automatic. But I agree with the points. I would say, look, just broadly speaking, when it comes to operational technology, we've always said, please don't take your same IT approach to our OT environments. We've had a history of stuff like this happen, to Tim's point. And so a lot of the things that we've done historically in OT has been more passive, more let's watch the network, let's monitor, let's do those things versus let's go make changes and adapt it or actively scan it and whatever. And what I'll say in this space is there's a bunch of companies now that'll come out and go, don't worry, we can safely do this. We can scan devices, we can make changes, we can throw agents, we can safely do it. It's OT native, it's ready, it's okay. And I think there's just a lot of risk that people forget that they're taking on with that. And so these active changes and active scanning and all those active things, I'm not saying don't do it, but realize that there is absolutely a resilience component to this and that there's real risk that we have to think about. There's no such thing as a safe way to do it.
If you have systems that are obligatory, like you have to, ensuring where you're putting those and then not using them at all levels, same vendor, same approach, same technology. So you have some level of assurance that something is not going to come in directly, whether it's corrupt, whether it's intentionally malicious that causes some type of operational impact. That is on the asset owners to engineer and operate their systems in a way where that is not a risk.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of lessons that we can draw from, but the focus of this podcast is to dive into some of the highlights. So, Rob, tell us about this, the 8th and the 9th malware that have been recently discovered.
Yeah. So
How is it
Fuxnet was
different
the
from
eighth.
Pipe Dream?
Yeah, so Pipe Dream really is kind of an attack framework. It's by far the most extensible malicious software we've seen for targeting OT, and it is still a threat and can be used. I mean, there's no sort of like patch it away. There's no like fix it away. It's just a good framework that leverages the native functionality of OT environments. Fuxnet was something more specific and very tailored to a specific environment. It really doesn't have a lot of ability to be used at a bunch of different places. And it was used supposedly by a Ukrainian hacktivist group hitting a site in Russia. Whereas Frostygoop was supposedly used by a Russian group hitting a city in Ukraine. Both of them have lessons learned. You can look at it and go, yeah, maybe the malware is not going to be used again, but here's the tactics, the way the malware accomplished what it was doing. What can we learn from that and apply in terms of prevention, detection, and response, making our systems better against these types of threats. I think the real takeaway, though, is we are consistently seeing more and more activity, more and more threats, more and more efforts by companies, countries, hacktivist groups, et cetera, to target these OT environments, specifically with OT expertise. And so the takeaway shouldn't be, oh my gosh, here's this malware, it's so bad. The takeaway should be, it's another data point that adversaries are consistently targeting civilian infrastructure that can impact local communities.
Yeah, you mentioned that Pipe Dream is an illustration of how nation-state actors' tools are, increasingly becoming sort of a way for, say, cyber criminals to use or leverage in the OT environment. Is that the same that we are seeing with this latest two strands of malware?
Yeah, so these latest two would be a good example of like more criminal-based organizations. There could be a government linkage, we don't know, but more hacktivist-like doing stuff, absolutely. Pipe Dream would be more, again, kind of a framework. And so when I look at Pipe Dream, that is a true state-level capability that may one day proliferate into criminals. These other two are more criminal-level capabilities. And so, long story short, the concern of a Pipe Dream getting to criminals still hasn't happened. It's just looking at sort of the forecast of the future. It's the very obvious thing to happen, and it's historically happened in IT security for every malware, every capability that once started at a government or state level eventually proliferated to criminals.
Okay, so one last question about the cyber threat landscape before we move into other control topics. What would be the motivations of cyber criminals in the OT space, besides ransomware, of course?
Yeah, so the motivations on targeting OT are pretty broad. There are some that do it for a political agenda, right? The hacktivist type stuff. We saw attacks in the water sector where a hacktivist group wanted to go and sort of protest Israel's conflict in Gaza. And so they were hacking Israeli-based vendors that were providing control elements into water services, as an example. And it was to get a message out, to scare the public and to get a message heard. There's some that do it for financial gain. Ransomware is a great example of that. Extortion, and not just ransomware, but hey, we're not going to let you operate your plant unless you pay us to sort of release control back to you. There's also intellectual property theft. And there are plenty of criminals that work very carefully with governments, and there are governments out there that would love to get certain intellectual property. I think a lot of people think intellectual property is just a trade secret or here's like a recipe, but it's not always that. A lot of times in the cases we see, intellectual property is how did you take cheap quality inputs and make high quality outputs? How did you engineer the manufacturing facility or the technology to actually be able to produce what you're doing? And that's very core intellectual property. And then, of course, there's some people that are just criminals that want to hurt people and want to cause chaos. And when you target IT, you talk about data theft, and you talk about credit cards and PII and health records. When you talk about OT, you can kill people.
That's right.
And unfortunately, that's the realm we live in.
Okay, so it's ego-based kind of
a wide range of things.
Right.
Are they working with a government or not? Is there a conflict ongoing or not? Are they trying to support a conflict? Is there something going on between Russia and Ukraine, and I'm a hacktivist group, and I want to help out as well? It's just there's a wide ideologies. Yep.
All right. Okay. Right. Okay. Tim, I want to turn to one of the 5 critical controls: gaining visibility into the traffic.
Of course.
I think one of the first steps that many people would say is, we need to have visibility into our devices, into our assets first, right? So what are the kind of challenges that organizations are facing right now?
It's an interesting space. So as we work in this field and we're going out to different environments, we understand some of the perceptions and the realities of how somebody has purchased a common, so you think of the periodic table from when you're in 7th grade in science, and all the different elements that make up kind of our world, we look to that of what are the atomic elements of how do we build a process? How do we automate? How do we digitize? And we look to, there's programmable logic controllers. There's a certain number of vendors who make them. There's a certain kind of real-time operating system that they're running on, certain programming languages. So we start to become more like each other as we look across all those different things and all those different environments. And we say from an attacker perspective, if you learn this and know this, you can achieve the following. But from an attacker perspective, when you say achieve the following, that has a whole lot of information that goes with it, meaning the adversary needs to have an understanding of the process that they're targeting and exactly what goal and objective they want to make. So we sound schizophrenic in that way, where we say, you all look the same from an adversary perspective, but then we say an adversary needs dwell time to understand the process, to know how to attack it and what to achieve.
Okay.
And then we feel the same way from a defender. If you're working from one type of facility and you go to a training and you say, well, I work in water, and everything they have there isn't my vendor, and what they're talking about is for aviation, so this isn't for me. So we spend a lot of time talking about, no, it is for you. It's the same types of protocols. It's the same types of architectures, same types of vendors and OEMs. So this is for you. You just have to think about it differently. And then we go do the same thing from an adversary perspective if you were on the offensive ops for pen testing and vulnerability assessments of what things are common from place to place to place, thinking about the atomic elements that you're going to find everywhere, but then saying there are uniquenesses to everywhere you go that you have to put on the, I'm not a subject matter expert of all things. I have to go to this particular place and learn how do they do what they do? How can I then take that knowledge to better defend it? And if I'm from an offensive side, how can I inform my vulnerability assessments or my pen tests? And if you were obviously on the targeting side, same kind of thing. How would I inform what would we need to do to achieve a goal on that particular target? Forever, we can talk the legacy side of it, and that'll be easy. Meaning in a lot of these spaces, we didn't have the ability to break out or hub out or switch port span or mirror so we could even see the data. So we fought for 15 years to get that visibility. We have it now, and then we've waited for vendors and software packages to come and give us the insights that we need, the ability to look for normal, the identification of abnormal, the absence of normal, known bad behaviors, known signature. And we now have vendors that can do that. And now that we're there, you start hearing discussions of, well, you should encrypt your protocols. And then we would get blind to what we spent 2 decades to achieve. So there's all of those conversations of what we fought to get to what we have, and then solid vendors coming in and producing tools that can let us have insights and knowledge on what we have. And now we're battling the don't encrypt everything because we can finally see it. So from a technical practitioner level, it's been 2 decades to get finally what we want. There's business side decisions of everybody doesn't have that. Everybody doesn't have a regulation or a justification or the resources to go and get the capability for sensors and ingest and platforms. And so everybody's at a different place in this race in regards to what can we do with the resources we have. And that's why the critical controls have been built the way they've been built, the way they've been prioritized to help you inform everything. They all touch each other. This isn't a do this one and you're good. It's a program for consideration across, and it doesn't have to be at every single site you have, every single system you have.
The top critical control that you mentioned as well is incident response. But before we come into that, right? So one quick take on, this terminology, OT/IT. You talked about digital transformation and how that has been, in the last 100 years, and of course still ongoing and accelerated during the COVID times, right?
For sure.
And in one of your SENS report, you also mentioned, I think one of the questions is, what is the most common initial attack vector that affects OT control systems? And the answer is 1/3 of the respondents say it's coming from the IT side.
Sure.
So these are OT/IT kind of, convergence or gap or mindset or whatever you call it, right? How do you think it is helping or hindering, a unified approach to, end-to-end sort of risk management of operational controls?
I'll give a very short answer, and then I'd like to hear Rob's. Where are attacks coming from shouldn't be shocking. That looking at all your connectivity, all your perimeters, everything you have, and what you allow in and what you allow out for system-to-system communications, for normal business, for insights, for leadership, management, oversight, and visibility. We allow a lot of things to talk to a lot of things, including patch management, change management, updates, signatures, tons of paths that have been added. Many of them are paths into the IT network. Those are not just paths for how we operate. Those are paths for adversaries to take advantage of as well. The second things that we add paths for is trusted remote access. So vendors, third parties, remote support personnel, so they can respond to an event instead of getting on a plane or driving hours to a remote site. So those things that we've taken from a business optimization perspective or from a response perspective, those are all there for our purpose, but they can be used by others. So that question should be like predicting the sun. You know exactly when it's going to happen. Number one is going to be attacks from IT into OT. Number two is going to be remote access. Then you start to get into a lot of other things, from supply chain to insiders to the variations of what you're operating, how you're operating it. But that question is going to be a similar answer for survey to survey to survey. It's how we built all these trusted connections. They're not just there for us.
Yeah, and I would say like this IT versus OT terminology and use cases and similar. First of all, before OT was getting used as a term in the security community, the enterprise IT community did all of the enterprise IT work on their enterprise IT systems. They didn't do almost anything on the OT environment. So it was really important to go, there is an OT portion of your company. Actually, it's the reason your company exists, and it does need a focus. And so it was really important to have a terminology to help people understand, hey, there's all this IT stuff, but there's also this OT stuff, and it's actually your operations. So I think that was very helpful. I see some folks say, hey, well, why can't we just call it T? Why can't we just talk about technology? And the reality is, it's a very actually different. You can't just take your same approaches. But it's okay to have an end-to-end risk management process. It's okay to have a whole program. But you treat your enterprise systems differently already. You don't treat the active domain controller the same way you treat an ERP. You don't treat a desktop that a person's operating the same way you treat your cloud resources. So to say, hey, this other stuff that interacts with physics and has very different consequences, very different impacts, very different types of systems, very different type of vulnerabilities, very different types of threats, let's treat it differently too, I think is a very fair proposition, and I always find it weird how much we're sort of faced with people pushing against it. What I've found from a market perspective is the only groups that have sort of advocated to just call it all IT or call it all CPS or call it whatever, the only groups that I've really seen advocating that are vendors who have a solution in the IT, and they're saying, no, I want you to deploy my solution in the other side as well. And we go, no, it's different. They go, no, it's not different. It's all just T. And so I have seen the only actual pushback be from a market force of I'd rather just go sell the same thing versus having specialized sales teams, specialized marketing, specialized products. And I am more interested in how can we protect businesses and understand the core components of that business than I am on how can we make it easier for vendors.
Yeah, I think there's an increasing focus on this terminology, cyber-informed engineering, is it? Like thinking about, the consequences and then work backwards from there in terms of risk management rather than thinking about, what kind of...
Yeah, Idaho National Labs has been putting out a lot of work on that. And it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's a very complicated thing to do, but it has purposeful applications at key sites to be able to say, how can we help engineer out some of the risk? A good example of that, one of the ways I always describe it is, if you think about a RTU controlling a circuit breaker, should that RTU be able to update its Facebook status? Probably not. Makes no sense. So how can we take out some of the functionality of that device? Because why have that? It's only now functionality that adversaries can use, but we'll never use that functionality. So in a more complicated way, that's what they're doing of, hey, actually, we know that we never want the boiler to go above 100 PSI. It doesn't make sense in our environment. Let's not allow it from an engineering capacity. So it's just good engineering with the understanding of what can go wrong from a consequence perspective as we start digitizing and automating our systems.
This is one of those things where terms, as simple as they seem, or statements, end up being really, really dangerous to our sector. Going IT and OT, it's all just T. That is completely ignoring all the uniqueness, diversity of the drivers and constraints for these environments, the skill sets of the people who need to work in them, the training, the how we need to work, the safety, everything that we do, it's ignoring all of that and saying they're all the same. And it becomes dangerous for people that hear that and believe it. They look to leaders and they hear them say it, and then they believe it, and then they think, I can go do the job I'm doing in IT in the same way in that plant. And now that person is putting themselves at risk. Safety. They're putting the equipment at risk, the communities they serve, because they think it's all the same. They've heard from leaders, it's all just T. You don't need to be uniquely trained for this job. You don't need unique skill sets. You don't need to work differently. We have to plan safety into our work. We have to plan security into our work. How we do our work is very different. And just saying it's all T is ignoring all of that. It's taking all the diversity of a community of people and saying, you're all just people. Everybody's the same. It is dangerous.
It's not only dangerous, but it's also where folks will look at it sometimes and go, oh, well, it's a Windows operating system, therefore it's IT. Well, no, it's an engineering workstation. It's controlling something. You have different risks in OT than in IT with different consequences, with different threats, and therefore just copy and pasting the same security answers that you've done in IT may not achieve the same value in OT. And so it's, hey, let's be tailored in a risk-based approach to what we're doing and understand that, yeah, like you mentioned safety. There are sites that you may go out to a site and kill yourself if you don't actually take a different approach to that environment. So it's just, there is IT and there is OT, and we want them to be separate in context, but let's work together as an organization. That's fine. What we're arguing is there's some people going, IT, OT, it's just T. That's harmful, that's dangerous.
Right, okay. I think there's a lot more we can delve into that particular topic, but
Different podcast.
yeah, right. Another podcast, I guess.
I versus O.
Right, okay. Yeah, so onto another critical control that you mentioned, incident response. I think a lot of our audience would probably think, right, I'm really surprised that you will find that, a lot of our operational controls systems do not have an incident response, or rather 50% is it in your survey?
Yes.
Because we would think that, if there's something blackout at a power plant, there's a backup plan, right? So what do you mean there's no incident response plan?
Yeah, meaning to that particular process at that site. So many, they look up in their organization to their organizational incident response plan, which tries to call together all of their IT environments of how do they respond, who responds, down at that site, down at that facility, and in that system. Often they do not have an operational technology incident response plan. They look to what the corporation has, and then if there was an event, they assume it's going to be what they would call upon and use. And it does not address any of the things that they would need to do uniquely if they had an incident at that facility.
So if there is a blackout, as an example, they know
That's
how
different.
to respond to it. They've built all those plans. All those facilities have it. What they don't have is they go, oh, we're vulnerable to cyber attacks. We never even thought about that before.
Sure.
Well, the IT people have a response plan, right? But in the same context of the conversation we were just having, the IT side of the house might not know what data to collect or how to get to the site or what safety procedures to take or deploy the right tools. And so what we see is most organizations have a response plan, but it's so generalized and focused on enterprise IT that there's no thought process of how would we go and respond to a cyber attack on the operations side. So we're saying put in place an ICS incident response plan and factor in what do you want to respond to? What type of threats do you want to be able to take on? Because that will inform, well, what data do I need to collect? Where do I need to collect it from? What type of visibility do I need to be able to get there?
Yeah.
And so that's why it's so critical. It helps you plan ahead of time, because if you do not plan for the incident ahead of time, it is very unlikely to be a successful incident response.
And this is a maturity discussion, meaning we can start from the perspective of if there was an incident at a energy management system, at a control center, and you take an IT plan, it does not address what they can do from a primary system to a secondary system to an offsite system to a secondary control center, and then how they would isolate and do hunt and do containment and do eradication, bring systems back up. That is the maturity to say, do you even have a plan for that? And do people know what their responsibility is? And then how do you continue to do your reliability services while the system is down? Is that in the incident response plan? And that is the beginning of it. Then you could go to operationalizing it to say, what if we tie this conversation together, and what if we had a blackout and we need to do a Black Start program and we don't have our SCADA system? Our Black Start
That's right,
programs
yeah.
look to all of these digital assets being up and available.
Yeah.
What is our cyber Black Start plan?
Right,
How
right.
are we restoring without? And as we've looked to that, we've come to the conclusions we need a lot more people, and we don't even have the mechanical tools in the field to do so. So there's things you learn as you have an OT incident response plan, and then you exercise it, and you tie it into operations. You learn more about what you need to change and do.
Again, that's quite a full day course, right? That's offered by Sen. So I think we're just squeezing a lot of information into this 10 minutes.
Yeah.
20 minutes on stage. We covered it all.
Yeah.
So I'm conscious of the time. Yeah. So I just want to end the podcast on a positive note.
Okay. Not death, not doom, not attacks. Yeah.
We're very positive. You can win.
So Robert, yeah, you mentioned yesterday that we don't really talk too much about the good news, right? That we have in this space. So, and you brought an example of, is it Voltex, is it? Or
Voltsite, yeah.
Yeah.
There's a group that targeted electric power sites in North America.
So there's a lot of good lessons, positive lessons
for
that
sure.
we learned from that.
For sure. There's a
Tell
bunch of
us.
companies that did get compromised. It is a serious threat, but there's a bunch of companies that the adversary was unsuccessful in targeting them because they did the security discussions that we're talking about, the 5 critical controls kind of stuff. And so I just think as an industry, there's almost this excitement of, oh my gosh, it was a big attack. Did you hear? And so that people share the news about that or write articles about that. What doesn't get in the news is, oh, the lights are still on. There's no news article. It's like, thanks, power company, the lights are still on.
Yeah.
Good job today. You get the article on, oh, the power's out. And so in the same context with cyber attacks, we don't often hear about or celebrate the fact that there's a lot of winning taking place. There's a lot of defense teams, in this case as well, in Voltsite, where the companies put in the security controls and won. And the adversary kept trying to get in, and was unsuccessful. And so I think it's worth noting, because if we don't do that, people feel defeated. They feel that it's not a winnable fight. They feel, well, if they want me, they'll compromise me anyways. That's not accurate. There are plenty of teams that have shown that you can stand up to even very sophisticated state actors by doing security fundamentals.
Out of critical infrastructure, we do not do a very good job of celebrating our wins on a daily basis. So at a people level, it's something that a colleague of ours, Mike Asante, really pursued. How are we going to recognize the people who have dedicated life to mission and everything that they've done from a service and a critical infrastructure perspective, cybersecurity, and he's really started kind of a program of recognition that is now named after him. That is at a people level. When we go down to at the process and at the plant, you walk in and you see signs everywhere of, it's been 725 days since we've had a safety incident. We don't have one. It's been X days since we've had a cybersecurity incident. And the people that are all involved in making sure that happens and the process continues to run safe, reliable, secure. We don't do a great job of celebrating those wins, but every day we have wins all over the place. This is an area where these environments should be easier for us to defend. If we're looking, if we have staff, if we're training and preparing them, we are better enabled to win this fight than we are the IT battles. And we care most about the OT and ICS. We're very much on the winning team.
Yeah.
Right.
OT.
OT, yes, yeah. Well, on that note, so maybe for the next podcast, we devote our time to talking about the winnings and the celebration of
That'd be great. You had power for 7 years.
Yeah,
You're
something
welcome.
like that.
You're welcome.
No problem.
Rather than starting our podcast on cyber threat landscape, right?
Exactly.
Right. So on that note, so thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Really appreciate that.